It had been exactly 9 days since I moved into what I thought was going to be my peaceful forever home. A modern, two-story house tucked inside a suburban neighborhood with quiet streets, mature trees, and just enough distance from the city to make the air cleaner and the nights darker in the best way. I had spent years saving for this place, selling my old fixer-upper, working extra shifts, and finally cashing in some investments I'd been holding since college. It wasn't just a home. It was a dream come true, complete with a large driveway, a backyard big enough for weekend barbecues, and most importantly, a three-car garage where my prized possession, a brand-new, fully loaded 2025 Midnight Blue sports sedan, could finally live safe from weather, vandals, and the random grocery cart from careless store lots. The car was the first brand-new one I'd ever bought. Ordered straight from the factory with every feature I wanted, right down to the custom stitching in the seats. I had only owned it for a week, and every time I opened the garage door, my heart still did a little skip when I saw it gleaming under the soft LED lights. I thought my biggest concern would be keeping bird droppings off it or remembering to keep it waxed. I was wrong. The trouble began on the fourth evening after moving in. When I first met her, the woman the neighbors whispered about but never seemed to confront directly. Her real name was Karen, and yes, in the most stereotypical twist of fate imaginable, she lived up to every horror story you've ever heard about the name in HOA communities. She was in her late 50s with overprocessed blonde hair, oversized sunglasses she wore even at dusk, and a permanent expression that suggested she had smelled something sour. I had been unloading some boxes from my garage when she strode over from across the street, heels clicking sharply on the pavement, holding a clipboard in one hand like it was a badge of authority. "You must be the new owner," she said, without a smile, glancing past me into my garage like she was inspecting it for code violations. I nodded politely, told her my name, and waited for a neighborly welcome. Instead, she launched straight into a 10-minute lecture about the HOA rules. No trash cans visible from the street, no unapproved lawn decorations, no overnight street parking, and an especially strange one about excessively reflective surfaces on vehicles, because they distract other drivers. I remember chuckling at that last one, thinking it was some bizarre overreach, but she didn't laugh. She was dead serious. "Your car there," she said, pointing to my sports sedan like it was a crime scene, "is flashy. We like to keep a certain aesthetic here." I told her it was parked in my garage most of the time and shouldn't be an issue. She pursed her lips like she didn't believe me. That was the first red flag. The second came 2 days later when I caught her taking photos of my driveway from across the street. When I stepped outside to ask if she needed something, she muttered something about documenting for the HOA records and walked away without explaining. I brushed it off. Maybe she was just one of those overly involved HOA types who needed a hobby, but then came the day that set everything into motion. It was a Saturday morning, warm and sunny, and I decided to pull the car out to give it its first proper wash since bringing it home. I had all my supplies laid out, buckets, microfiber cloths, wax, and some music playing quietly from the garage speaker. As I was rinsing the roof, I noticed Karen's SUV creeping slowly past my house. It was an older, beige crossover that looked like it hadn't seen a car wash in years, and she was staring so openly it was almost comical. She drove around the block twice more before finally pulling into her own driveway. I thought nothing of it until an hour later when I stepped inside for just a few minutes to grab a drink and take a call. When I came back out, my heart stopped. My brand new car, my pride and joy, now had a deep, jagged scrape running along the entire passenger side, from the headlight to the rear door, as if someone had deliberately keyed it, but with something far heavier, maybe a metal pole or the corner of a bumper. Shards of blue paint littered the driveway. I froze, staring, my stomach churning with disbelief and rage. Then I saw it. Karen's SUV parked half in her driveway, half on the street, with fresh blue paint smeared along the edge of her front bumper. The match was undeniable. My hands shook as I pulled out my phone and took photos from every angle. The scrape on my car, the paint on hers, the position of the vehicles. I was still snapping pictures when Karen herself came striding over, already on the offensive. "You need to move your car," she barked. It was blocking the sidewalk. I stared at her, my voice low but tight. "You hit my car?" She had the gall to roll her eyes. "Don't be ridiculous. If your car wasn't such an eyesore, maybe this wouldn't have happened. It doesn't belong in this neighborhood." That was it. The mix of her blatant lie, her smug tone, and the fact that she had just vandalized my dream car lit a fuse in me I didn't know I had. I told her point blank that I had photos proving everything, that the police were going to see them and that she was going to pay for the damage. She smirked like she'd heard it all before and said, "Good luck getting the OO to side with. You, around here, I make the rules." I didn't even respond. I just turned and walked inside, already dialing the non-emergency police line to report the damage. But as I sat on hold, staring out the window at her smugly standing in her driveway, another thought began to form. Yes, I could call the cops. Yes, I could file an insurance claim. But neither of those things would truly get the message across. To someone like Karen, someone who thought she was untouchable in her little kingdom? Then my eyes landed on the bright orange tow truck business card stuck to my fridge, left there by the previous homeowner. I remembered the conversation I'd had with him during closing about how the property lines here gave me sole authority over the small private lane in front of my house, meaning I had the legal right to remove any vehicle that parked there without my permission. My gaze drifted back to Karen's SUV, still straddling the line between her driveway and that very lane. The beginnings of a plan, fast, petty, and perfectly legal, started to take shape. And if I played my cards? Right, it would unfold before she even realized what was happening. The morning after the nightmarish scene in the driveway, where Karen had deliberately rammed her aging SUV into the side of my week-old car and then stood there smirking like she'd just done the neighborhood a favor, I woke to the sound of distant hammering and the faint whine of a leaf blower, the telltale background noise of an HOA community in full swing. Except, unlike the usual passive-aggressive landscaping wars, this time the noise seemed more like the opening act to a bigger, nastier confrontation. My phone had already blown up with texts from neighbors, half of them warning me that Karen was on the warpath, half of them telling me they had video evidence of the incident but were afraid to get involved publicly. I was still sipping my coffee when I spotted her, strutting down the sidewalk with a clipboard tucked under. Her arm, sunglasses perched on her nose, despite the cloudy morning, and that smug, tight-lipped grin that said she thought she had already won. She didn't bother knocking this time, just stormed onto my porch like she owned it and started in on a tirade about property violations, community standards, and how my choice of vehicle was a visual nuisance. Her excuse for the dent she left in my car? She claimed it was parked illegally and obstructing access to the community's shared turnaround space. I reminded her calmly, though my pulse was spiking, that the turnaround was on my property line, fully documented in my deed, and she had no jurisdiction there whatsoever. She smirked as if my property deed was irrelevant in the face of her self-appointed authority. And then she dropped the next bombshell. She'd already filed a report with the HOA board demanding I pay her for the damage to her SUV and threatening to escalate to small claims court if I refused. My jaw almost hit the floor. Not only was she doubling down, she was flipping the narrative completely, trying to paint herself as the victim while I was still dealing with the shock of having my brand new VAICLE damaged before the first oil change. That's when I decided enough. I called my insurance, laid out the events in meticulous detail, and forwarded them the videos I had from my home security cameras, making sure they had crystal clear footage of her reversing at full speed into my car. The adjuster was stunned at her brazenness, and within an hour, they had flagged her claim as fraudulent and initiated their own legal process. But that was just the beginning. I also called my friend Mark, who ran a reputable towing company in town and owed me a favor after I'd helped him negotiate with the city over a zoning dispute. I explained what happened, and his response was short, direct, and music to my ears. "Send me the address, I'll be there in 20. Meanwhile, Karen wasn't done with her morning performance. She had apparently decided to make my case a neighborhood spectacle, loudly telling anyone who passed that some people think they can move in here and disrespect the community, and how real residents like her needed to take action. I watched her from my porch, calmly sipping my second cup of coffee, as she made a big show of parking her SUV halfway across the sidewalk outside my house, as if marking her territory. She had no idea that her little stage was about to collapse. When Mark's tow truck rolled up, it was like a scene from an action movie. The hydraulics hissed, the steel winch clanked, and Mark, with his baseball cap pulled low, hopped out with a grin that said this was going to be fun. I pointed to the SUV. "That's the one," I said, handing him a copy of the legal documentation I'd prepared the night before, a certified letter stating that Karen's vehicle was trespassing on my private property and obstructing access to my driveway, giving me full right under state law to have it removed. Karen saw the truck, and her smugness faltered for the first time. She stomped over, waving her hands like she could physically stop the process, yelling about how this was illegal and that she was going to call the police. Mark didn't even look up from hooking the chains to her axle. "Go ahead," he said flatly. "I'll explain to them how your car's on private property without permission. You want to see who wins that conversation." The neighbors began gathering, like it was free entertainment. Phones came out, cameras rolled, and within minutes, Karen's SUV was being slowly but inevitably pulled onto the flatbed, her voice rising in pitch and volume as she realized she couldn't stop it. She actually tried climbing onto the back bumper to block the tow, but Mark was prepared. He stepped back, pointed at her, and said, "Ma'am, if you don't get down, that's interfering with a lawful tow. That's a separate charge." She sputtered something about community bylaws and unwritten agreements before finally stepping off, but she wasn't going quietly. She whipped out her phone, called 911, and dramatically reported that a strange man was stealing her car in broad daylight. By the time the patrol car rolled up, I had already given the officer a printout of the property map, a copy of my deed, the time-stamped security footage showing her SUV obstructing my driveway, and the certified trespass notice. The officer barely even glanced at Karen before telling her flatly, "Ma'am, this is a civil matter, and from what I see, he's within his rights." That's when her anger turned to something more dangerous: cold calculation. She narrowed her eyes at me and said, "This isn't over." I smiled back and replied, "You're right, it's not." Because while she was busy scheming about her next petty attack, I was already 3 steps ahead. That night I sat down with my lawyer, an old friend from college, who loved nothing more than dismantling entitled HOA board members, and we started building a case, not just for the damage to my car, but for harassment, property interference, and a pattern of targeted misconduct. I was done playing defense. Now, it was time to take the fight directly to her and, by extension, the entire HOA she thought would shield her. The first step? Pulling every single public record on the HOA's financials, past board decisions, and legal disputes. The second? Talking to other residents who had been bullied into silence, encouraging them to share their stories. And the third? Making sure Karen learned that messing with me wasn't just a bad idea, it was the biggest mistake of her self-appointed reign over the neighborhood. The following morning felt heavier than most, not because of the late-night planning session I'd had with my lawyer, but because the air in the neighborhood seemed thicker with tension, the kind that makes your skin prickle when you step outside. I opened the blinds and saw Karen standing in the middle of the street with 2 other HOA board members, gesturing wildly at my driveway where my newly repaired car sat gleaming in the early sun, the fresh paint and buffed surface almost an insult to her failed attempt at vandalism. And before I could even sip my coffee, she was at my door, pounding hard enough to rattle the frame, yelling that the HOA had voted to fine me for improper vehicle storage, despite the fact that my car was parked exactly where it was supposed to be. And this time I didn't even bother with pleasantries. I opened the door, phone already recording, and asked her to repeat every single accusation. She faltered for a moment, realizing the lens was pointed directly at her, but recovered with that smug, entitled smirk that seemed to be her natural expression, spewing some nonsense about community standards and how my vehicle was, too. Flashy and lowered property values as if my hard-earned possession was somehow a neighborhood blight, when in reality it was her own behavior that had people avoiding this street like the plague. I asked her point-blank if she had anything to do with the damage from 2 nights ago, and she laughed, not a nervous laugh, but the kind of laugh that said she wanted me to know without saying the words, and when she tried to pivot into more HOA threats, I calmly pointed out that in just a few days we'd be standing in a very different room, one with a judge who wouldn't care about her imaginary bylaws when faced with my video footage, my receipts, and the witness statements I'd gathered. Her face twitched at that, and before she could spit out another lie, I told her to leave my property or I'd add trespassing to the list of charges, and maybe, just maybe, she'd get to explain to the court why her car was currently parked halfway over a fire lane, something I'd already photographed and documented. She stormed off in that overly dramatic stomp, the other board members trailing behind her like unsure backup singers, and I could hear her muttering about taking the fight up a level, which honestly just made me smile because I'd been quietly raising the stakes myself, not through confrontation, but through airtight preparation. By mid-afternoon, my lawyer had arranged for a private investigator, a retired cop with a knack for finding the smallest, overlooked detail, to go over Karen's activities in the days leading up to the incident, and what he found made my stomach tighten with a mix of anger and grim satisfaction. Security camera footage from a convenience store 2 blocks away, time-stamped about an hour before my car was smashed, showing Karen and an unidentified man loading what looked very much like a crowbar and a baseball bat into her trunk. Add to that the receipt for spray paint purchased the same night, which matched the exact shade used in the graffiti across my hood. And suddenly the mystery behind my car's destruction wasn't much of a mystery anymore. That evening, I decided to give Karen one last chance to back down, not because I thought she would. I knew her ego was too inflated for that, but because it would make her refusal look even worse in court. I knocked on her door just after sunset, greeted not by Karen but by her husband, a weary-looking man who seemed both embarrassed and exhausted, and I politely explained that if they wanted to settle this quietly, now was the time. His shoulders sagged as if he'd been waiting for someone to offer an out. But before he could respond, Karen appeared behind him, her voice sharp and mocking, telling me she wasn't afraid of my little legal games and that people like me always lose, a phrase that stuck with me because it revealed the way she saw this entire situation, not as a matter of right or wrong, but as a battle she was entitled to win by default. I didn't argue. I just told her I'd see her in court and walked away, the sound of her scoffing fading behind me. Over the next 48 hours, I doubled down, meeting with my lawyer to review not only the vandalism evidence but also the growing stack of HOA violations Karen herself had committed, the illegal alterations to her property, the misuse of HOA funds, the unapproved storage shed visible from the street, all of which had been documented by neighbors too afraid to speak out until now. By the time the hearing date arrived, we weren't just defending my case. We were holding a mirror up to Karen's entire pattern of abuse. And that morning, as I dressed for court, I couldn't help but think about the first time I met her. How she'd tried to size me up as someone she could push around, and how now she'd finally have to stand in front of someone she couldn't bully, lie to, or intimidate. When we walked into the courthouse, she was already there, wearing a smug grin and flanked by 2 HOA board members, whispering furiously into her phone, probably spinning some last-minute story. But the moment she saw the stack of folders in my lawyer's arms, her grin faltered just slightly, enough to tell me that somewhere, deep down, she knew this wasn't going to end the way she'd imagined, and by the time the bailiff called the case, I was more than ready to watch her realize exactly how badly she'd underestimated me. By the next morning, the neighborhood buzzed with whispered speculation about what had happened between me and Karen, though the truth was far more calculated than the wild rumors being spun at mailboxes and coffee shops. After the HOS late night emergency meeting where I was told Karen had tried to rally support for an immediate sanction, against me, but found herself met with raised eyebrows and cautious glances. I knew I had successfully shifted the power dynamic, yet that didn't mean I was done. Karen's arrogance and casual destruction of my property had cost me tens of thousands in damage, not to mention hours of wasted time dealing with insurance and legal paperwork, and I had no intention of letting her walk away from this with her smugness intact. So I decided it was time to launch the part of my plan that would hit her where it hurt most, her finances and her public image. I began by contacting a private investigator, someone I'd worked with before in my business dealings, a man named Travis who had a knack for digging into financial skeletons without leaving a trace, and I explained the situation to him in a way that made it clear this wasn't about petty revenge. This was about accountability, about making sure Karen's dangerous sense of entitlement had real consequences. Travis got to work immediately, and within a week, he sent me a report. That made my jaw drop, not because it was shocking she had dirt on her, but because of just how much there was. Karen was behind on her property taxes, had 3 maxed-out credit cards she was paying only minimums on, and most damning of all, had a pending lawsuit against her from a contractor she'd stiffed on payment for unauthorized changes to her patio renovation. This wasn't just the profile of a difficult neighbor. This was someone living on a house of cards, one that was already swaying in the breeze, and all it needed was a gentle push to collapse. I decided to become that push. First, I sent an anonymous tip to the contractor's lawyer that Karen was likely hiding assets in a joint account under her sister's name. Travis confirmed this through bank traces, and the lawyer jumped on it like a shark scenting blood, filing a motion that would freeze the account until she appeared in court. Then I contacted the county tax office and inquired as a concerned resident about the lien process for unpaid property taxes, making sure to include Karen's parcel number in my example so that it would end up flagged for review. And while these legal and financial storms gathered over her, I had another, more public card to play. The HOA's own annual audit was coming up, and I volunteered just days earlier to assist the treasurer in compiling financial records. With my access, I discovered Karen had been reimbursed by the HOA for community beautification, expenses that were clearly unrelated to any shared property. Receipts showed she had purchased expensive potted plants, lawn decor, and even a high-end gas grill, all charged to the HOA's budget. And though I could have gone straight to the board, I decided a public reveal would be more effective. At the next meeting, in front of 24 residents, I innocently asked during the open forum whether personal luxury items were considered legitimate HOA expenses, then slid the receipts across the table to the treasurer, who looked at them, then at Karen, then back at the receipts, her eyebrows shooting up so high I thought they'd vanish into her hairline. Karen tried to interrupt, claiming it was all authorized, but the treasurer coolly replied that no such authorization existed in the minutes, and murmurs began to ripple through the room like wind through dry grass. By the end of the night, Karen had stormed out, her face flushed a furious crimson, but her troubles were only beginning. 2 days later, the contractor's lawsuit escalated when the court approved the asset freeze, and a week after that, the county posted a public notice about her delinquent taxes, visible to anyone who walked past her driveway, the once feared HOA enforcer now found herself ducking behind curtains when neighbors passed, her phone going unanswered, and her car, yes, the same one I'd had towed, sitting in her driveway with a for sale sign taped in the window, a silent testament to how quickly her power had evaporated. But for me, the sweetest moment came when I received a call from the HOA president, who, in an uncharacteristically polite tone, asked if I might consider stepping in as interim vice president of the board since some leadership changes were about to occur. I smiled as I looked out at the spot where my brand new car, now fully repaired and gleaming in the morning sun, sat parked safely in my driveway. "Sure," I said, keeping my tone casual, though my satisfaction was anything. "But I think I could help bring some balance to the community." By the time the legal dust began to settle, the story of Karen's spectacular self-destruction had spread well beyond our little neighborhood. becoming a cautionary tale among HOA boards across the state, but for me, the final chapter was both the most satisfying and the most surreal, because it wasn't just about winning in court, it was about watching every last ounce of her smug power evaporate in real time. The morning of the verdict, the courthouse parking lot was buzzing with reporters, local residents, and even a few people from the next county over who had apparently been following the case like it was a primetime drama. And when I walked up the steps, people actually cheered, which was something I never expected in my life, but I didn't slow down. I wanted to get this over with, and inside the courtroom, Karen sat at the defendant's table in a suit that looked like it hadn't been tailored for her frame, her hair a mess compared to her usual perfectly styled helmet, and her eyes fixed on the table as if avoiding everyone's gaze might make her invisible. Her attorney, a man who looked like he regretted ever taking her case, kept flipping through his notes while sneaking glances at the prosecution table where my attorney Dana sat confidently with her stack of evidence, including the high-definition drone footage of Karen smashing my car with her ornamental metal garden stake, footage that had already been played so many times during the trial it had practically become public property. The judge came in, the gavel came down, and in a calm, measured voice, he delivered a ruling so thorough and devastating it might as well have been scripted for television. Not only was Karen found guilty of property destruction and trespassing, but she was also ordered to pay full restitution for the damage to my car, reimburse every single towing fee she'd tried to stick me with over the past year, cover all court costs, and, in a move that made her face flush crimson, surrender her position on the HOA board immediately. As if that wasn't enough, the civil suit we'd filed alongside the criminal case granted me additional damages for harassment and emotional distress, meaning that for the next decade or so, a sizable chunk of Karen's paycheck would be funneled directly into my bank account, a poetic form of monthly apology she'd have no choice but to make. When court adjourned, she stormed out without looking at me, but the media swarmed, their cameras catching her every scowl as she shoved her way through the crowd, while I stood with Dana, answering questions and making it clear that this case wasn't just about me, it was about every HOA resident who'd been bullied, overcharged, or targeted by someone drunk on a tiny bit of neighborhood power. Over the next week, Karen's fall from grace accelerated. She was banned from attending HOA meetings as a guest. Her former allies on the board distanced themselves so fast it was almost comedic, and the state HOA Oversight Committee announced they were launching an audit into the neighborhood's financial records, something that had clearly been needed for years. Meanwhile, my life returned to a level of peace I hadn't experienced since moving in. My new car, which the insurance company had replaced at no cost after the footage proved the damage was malicious, sat gleaming in my driveway, untouched. And whenever Karen had to drive past my house on her way to work, she'd keep her gaze locked straight ahead like she was afraid even glancing at me might set off another chain of disasters. Neighbors who'd once been too intimidated to speak against her now waved when they saw me, some even stopping to say thank you for taking one for the team. And one afternoon, I came home to find a basket of baked goods on my porch with a note that read, "For the guy who finally beat Karen at her own game." The HOA itself underwent a transformation too, with new leadership putting an end to many of the pointless fines and arbitrary rules that had made living there such a headache. And while I still had my reservations about organized neighborhood governance, I had to admit things were running far smoother without Karen's iron grip. Months later, I learned from a mutual acquaintance that Karen had sold her house at a loss and moved 2 towns over, a decision likely fueled by the fact that every grocery store trip, gas station visit, and PTA meeting had become an exercise in public embarrassment for her, and while I could have left it at that, I'll admit I allowed myself one small final victory lap. I printed out a still frame from the drone footage of her mid-swing, garden stake in hand, mouth twisted in, a furious yell, and mailed it anonymously to her new address with nothing but a sticky note reading, "Smile for the camera." Maybe it was petty, maybe it was unnecessary, but after everything she'd done, from smashing my property to trying to get my car towed, to lying to the police, It felt like the perfect bookend to a saga that had started with her thinking she could ruin my day, only to end with me dismantling her entire reign of petty terror, one legal blow at a time. And as I sat on my porch that evening, sipping a cold drink and listening to the quiet hum of a neighborhood finally free from her nonsense, I realized that sometimes the best revenge isn't just getting even. It's making sure the person who wronged you